The drill bit's vibration traveled up Mei Chen's arm as she guided the massive boring machine deeper into the moon's crust. Europita, the smallest moon of HD 209458b, had proven to be a veritable treasure trove of rare Earth elements and xenon isotopes. Exactly what the Terran Mining Consortium had been hoping for when they'd sent the expedition out here, 12 light years from Earth. "How's our progress looking?" May asked over the comm, her voice steady despite the constant shuddering of the platform beneath her feet. Darius Zhou's voice crackled back. "We are approaching the 2-kilometer mark. Core samples are showing increased concentrations of palladium and osmium. Jackpot, if you ask me." May allowed herself a small smile. The TMC brass would be pleased. This find alone would justify the expense of sending the Prospector's dream all the way out here. 4 years of cryosleep and another 6 months setting up the mining operation. All worth it for what they were pulling out of Europita's depths. "Kowalski, what's our structural integrity looking like?" she asked, turning to her engineering specialist. Jacob Kowalski frowned at his monitors. "Something weird happening with the seismic readings. Could be nothing, but..." He trailed off, adjusting something on his display. "Actually, I think we're getting some unusual feedback from the deep scanner. Almost like there's a hollow space below us." "Natural cavern," May suggested. "Doesn't match the profile," Jacob said, shaking his head. "The geometry is too regular." May felt a prickle of unease at the back of her neck. "Regular how?" Before Jacob could answer, the entire platform lurched violently, sending tools and equipment crashing to the floor. May grabbed the console to steady herself as warning klaxons began to blare. "Drills hit something," Darius shouted over the comm. "Something hard, harder than diamond." "The bit's shattered. Pull it back," May ordered, already moving toward the drill controls. "Full retrieval now." The emergency lights flashed crimson as the drill mechanism began its automated withdrawal sequence. May could hear the groaning of metal under stress, the whine of hydraulics pushed beyond their limits. "We have got a breach," Jacob yelled, pointing to one of the monitors where a schematic of the drill shaft showed a red flashing section. "Something's coming up the borehole." May felt her blood run cold. "What do you mean, something?" And then she saw it on the camera feed, a silvery, almost liquid-like substance flowing up the drill shaft, moving against gravity with deliberate purpose. It wasn't like any mineral she'd ever seen. It moved like it was alive. "Seal the shaft," she commanded, slamming her hand down on the emergency containment button. Titanium blast doors slid shut with a resounding clang, cutting off their view of whatever was surging up from the depths. For a moment, silence fell over the control room. May exchanged glances with Jacob and Darius, all of them breathing hard. "Did we contain it?" Darius asked quietly. As if an answer, a dull thud came from the other side of the blast doors, followed by another, and another, each impact stronger than the last. "All personnel, evacuate to the surface habitat," May said into the comm, keeping her voice calm despite the mounting dread. "This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." Whatever they'd awakened below was coming up to meet them, and somehow, May knew that the titanium doors wouldn't hold it for long. Captain Alexander Petrov had seen a lot in her 20 years with the Terran Space Forces. Pirate raids in the Kuiper Belt, the methane storms of Titan, even the disastrous first contact with the Proxima Centauri hive minds. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the distress call from the Prospector's dream. "Play it again," she ordered, standing on the bridge of the T-Ceph Hyperion, arms folded across her chest. Her communications officer, Lieutenant Park, nodded and tapped his console. The holographic display flickered to life, showing the haggard face of Mei Chen. "This is Chief Mining Engineer Chen of the TMC vessel Prospector's dream." The recording began, static occasionally distorting the image. "We have encountered an entity of unknown origin during deep drilling operations on Europita. It appears to be sentient and extremely hostile. We have lost 17 personnel already. The entity seems to be composed of some kind of programmable matter. It can reshape itself, and, and it's absorbing our technology somehow, integrating it, learning from it. May's image glanced over her shoulder, fear evident in her eyes. We have barricaded ourselves in the main habitat dome, but I don't know how long we can hold out. The entity is becoming more sophisticated by the hour. It's trying to access our ship systems. If it manages to gain control of our vessel, the transmission cut out briefly before resuming, requesting immediate military assistance. Do not attempt peaceful contact. I repeat, do not attempt peaceful contact. This thing isn't interested in communication. It only wants to. May's eyes widened suddenly. It's breaking through. Everyone fall back to. The transmission ended in a burst of static. Captain Petrov's jaw tightened. The Hyperion had been the closest TSEF vessel when the distress call went out. But even at maximum burn, they were still 6 hours from Europita. Any response to our hails? She asked. Lieutenant Park shook his head. Nothing, Captain. Complete silence for the past 28 hours. Petrov turned to her tactical officer. Commander Reyes, what options do we have if this entity has indeed taken control of the Prospector's dream? Esteban Reyes, a veteran of the Proxima conflict, brought up a tactical display. The dream is primarily a mining vessel, but it does have minimal defensive capabilities. Nothing that should concern the Hyperion. However, he paused, frowning. If this entity is as adaptive as Engineer Chen suggests, and if it has access to the ship's systems and database, it could potentially repurpose the mining equipment aboard. The Dream carries several tactical nuclear charges for large-scale excavation. Nukes, Petrov said flatly. Wonderful. There's something else, Captain. Her science officer, Dr. Imani Washington, interjected. She'd been unusually quiet during the briefing, absorbed in analyzing data from the Prospector's Dream's initial surveys of Europita. I have been reviewing the deep scans they performed before they began drilling. There's something very strange about the structure they uncovered. She brought up a three-dimensional model on the main view screen. This is the cavity their drill broke into. Notice the geometry. Perfect hexagons, repeated in a complex lattice structure. This isn't natural. It's engineered. And based on the radiation signature, it's been there for approximately 3 million years. Petrov stared at the display, the implications sinking in. You were saying we are dealing with technology from an alien civilization that's been extinct for 3 million years. I'm saying, Dr. Washington replied carefully, that whatever they found down there has been waiting for a very, very long time. And now it's awake. The bridge fell silent as they all contemplated this. Finally, Petrov spoke. Second 1 throughout the ship. All hands to battle stations. I want a full tactical assessment of the Prospector's Dream and all potential threat vectors by the time we reach Europita. And prepare a quantum-encrypted burst transmission to TSEF Command. They need to know what we are dealing with. As her crew sprang into action, Petrov remained standing before the view screen, studying the alien structure buried beneath Europita's surface. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to face something beyond their understanding. Something ancient and patient and utterly inhuman, and the clock was ticking. Mei Chen had never thought she'd die in space. Growing up in the sprawling arcologies of New Shanghai, she'd been fascinated by the stars, yes, but her passion had always been for what lay beneath, the minerals and metals that powered humanity's expansion into the cosmos. She'd become a mining engineer to be part of that great endeavor, to help secure the resources that would ensure humanity's future among the stars. Now, huddled in the emergency shelter of Europita Outpost with the 7 surviving members of her team, that future seemed very far away indeed. How much oxygen do we have left? She asked, her voice hoarse from the acrid smoke that had filled the habitat dome before they'd sealed themselves in the shelter to Dr. Abernathy, their medical officer, checked the display. About 16 hours at current consumption rates. After that, He didn't need to finish the sentence. 16 hours. Not enough time for the Hyperion to reach them. Even if the TSEF vessel had received their distress call and was already en route at maximum speed. What about the emergency beacon? Mei asked, turning to the communications specialist, a young woman named Fatima Okoro. Fatima shook her head grimly. The entity has control of all exterior communications arrays. I have tried bypassing, but she gestured helplessly at her makeshift console, cobbled together from emergency equipment. It's learning our systems faster than I can work around it. A dull thud reverberated through the shelter, another impact against the reinforced door. They've been coming at regular intervals for the past hour, growing steadily stronger. It's testing the structure, Jacob Kowalski said quietly, probing for weaknesses. Mei looked around at the faces of her team, exhausted, frightened, but still determined. They deserved better than this. They deserved a leader who could get them out alive. We need to understand what we are dealing with, she said, straightening her shoulders. Dr. Ivanov, you studied the scan data. What can you tell us about this entity? Dr. Elena Ivanov, their xenogeologist, pulled up the limited data they'd managed to salvage on her tablet. Based on what we have observed, it appears to be some form of programmable matter controlled by distributed intelligence, almost like a physical neural network. It doesn't have a central brain or processing unit that we can identify, so we can't just kill the head of the snake. Darius asked. I don't think so, Elena replied. It seems to function more like a colony organism, with each part capable of independent action, but all working toward a collective goal. And what goal is that? Mei pressed that Elena's expression was grim. Based on its behavior, expansion, consumption, it's absorbing our technology and incorporating it into itself, learning from it, evolving. Another impact against the door, harder this time. A hairline crack appeared in the reinforced composite. We need a plan, Mei said, thinking rapidly. We can't just wait here to die. What about the shuttle? Fatima suggested. If we could reach it, the entity has control of the docking bay, Jacob reminded her. And even if we could get to the shuttle, the dream would blast us out of the sky the moment we try to leave. The entity has control of the ship's defensive systems now. Mei's eyes narrowed as an idea began to form. What about the mining explosives? The ones we were going to use for the next excavation phase. They're in Storage Base C, Darius said. Which is, his face fell, currently overrun by the entity. But if we could get to them, Mei pressed, could we use them to, I don't know, stun or disrupt the entity long enough to reach the shuttle? Dr. Ivanov looked thoughtful. The entity seems sensitive to electromagnetic pulses. We saw that when we tried to use the EM cutting tools against it. A large enough explosion might create an EMP that could temporarily disable parts of it. It would have to be precisely timed, Jacob added, warming to the idea. And we need a way to trigger the explosives remotely. Mei nodded, the plan taking shape in her mind. Fatima, can you rig up a remote detonator from the equipment we have here? I think so, Fatima said, already mentally inventorying their supplies. But someone would still need to get to Storage Base C and place the charges. I will go, Mei said without hesitation. Not alone, Darius cut in firmly. I'm coming with you. Mei wanted to refuse, wanted to insist that as chief engineer, the responsibility was hers alone, but she knew he was right. The task would require at least 2 people. All right, she agreed. Darius and I will go for the explosives. Jacob, you, and Dr. Abernathy prepare the shuttle for emergency launch. Fatima, work on that remote detonator. Dr. Ivanov and the others will stay here to coordinate. She looked at each of them in turn, these brave men and women who'd followed her across 12 light years to an alien moon. I can't promise this will work, but I can promise you this. I'm not going to let that thing take us without a fight. We are getting off this rock, and we're going to make sure this entity never threatens anyone else. Another impact shook the door, crack widening visibly. We need to move now, Mei said, checking the charge on her plasma cutter, a mining tool, but the closest thing they had to a weapon. The moment we leave, seal the door behind us. Don't open it again until you hear from us or until that thing breaks through. In which case, we follow the plan Dr. Ivanov finished for her, and hope the Hyperion gets here in time to pick up the pieces. Mei nodded, exchanging a somber look with Darius. Then, taking a deep breath, she moved to the emergency airlock that would allow them to exit without exposing the others. Good luck, Dr. Abernathy said quietly as the airlock began to cycle. Luck, Mei thought grimly as she and Darius prepared to step out into the corridor beyond. Against an ancient alien entity that had been waiting beneath Europita's surface for millions of years, they were going to need a lot more than luck. They were going to need a miracle. The corridor outside the emergency shelter was dimly lit by flickering emergency lights. Portions of the wall and ceiling were covered in the silvery, flowing substance that characterized the entity, like liquid metal that moved with deliberate intelligence. In places, it had integrated pieces of the outpost technology into itself, creating bizarre hybrid structures of alien matter and human engineering. Stay clear of it, Mei whispered, though the entity had already demonstrated an uncanny ability to sense their presence even without conventional senses. We don't know if it can absorb organic matter yet being the operative word, Darius muttered, keeping his infrared cutter raised. They discovered early on that intense heat could temporarily repel the entity, though it always returned, seemingly more resistant than before. They moved carefully through the habitat module, stepping over debris and the occasional dark stain that Mei tried not to think about too hard. Not everyone had made it to the emergency shelter when the entity had breached the main dome. Storage Base C is 2 modules over, Darius said, consulting the schematic on his tablet. We'll need to pass through life support to get there. Mei nodded grimly. Life support had been one of the first sections the entity had targeted, forcing them to switch to emergency systems. She didn't want to think about what they might find there. As they approached the sealed door to life support, Mei paused, listening. There was a strange humming sound coming from the other side. Not the normal operating noise of the machinery, but something more discordant, almost like, "Is that singing?" Darius whispered, his face pale in the emergency lighting. It did sound like singing. If singing could be done by something with no lungs or vocal cords. A vibration in the metal itself, rising and falling in patterns that were almost but not quite musical. It's communicating, Mei realized. Or processing information, maybe. Whatever it's doing, I don't like it, Darius said. Should we find another route? Mei checked the schematic. No time. This is the only way to Storage Base C without going outside the habitat. And our EVA suits are in the main locker room, which is completely overrun, Darius finished. Right. With a deep breath, Mei pressed the door control. Nothing happened. Manual override, she said, pointing to the emergency release. Together, they turned the heavy lever, and the door slid open with a reluctant hiss. The singing grew louder. Life support was transformed. The once orderly array of machinery had been reshaped into something alien and incomprehensible. The entity had integrated itself with the environmental systems, forming a complex lattice of silvery tendrils and repurposed human technology. At the center of the room, a structure rose from the floor to the ceiling, a spiraling column of the alien matter that pulsed with an internal light. And it was from this column that the singing emanated, vibrations traveling through the very structure of the habitat. My God, Darius breathed. It's building something. Mei's engineering mind tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The configuration of the machinery, the flow of energy. It's not just building, she said slowly. It's transforming, converting our life support systems into something else. What? I think. Mei swallowed art. I think it's trying to reshape our habitat into something more suited to itself and less suited to us. As if in response to her words, the singing changed pitch, becoming more urgent. The column at the center of the room pulsed brighter, and tendrils of the silvery substance began to extend outward, toward them. "Run!" Mei shouted, raising her plasma cutter and firing a continuous beam at the approaching tendrils. The intense heat caused them to recoil momentarily, buying precious seconds as she and Darius sprinted through the chamber. They reached the far door just as the tendrils regrouped, flowing across the floor with alarming speed. Darius slammed his hand against the emergency close button, and the heavy door slid shut, cutting off a tendril that had almost made it through. The severed piece writhed on the floor, then went still. "That was too close," Darius gasped, leaning against the wall to catch his breath. Mei knelt to examine the severed tendril, careful not to touch it. Already, it was losing its silvery luster, turning dull and lifeless. Interesting. It seems the individual components can't survive for long when separated from the main mass. "So it does have a weakness," Darius said. "Maybe." Mei stood up, "but I doubt we could sever enough of it to make a difference. We need those explosives." They continued through the connecting corridor, which was mercifully free of the entity's presence, and reached the door to Storage Bay C. This time, the electronic lock was still functioning. "Handy that you are the chief engineer with all the access codes," Darius said with a weak attempt at humor as Mei input her clearance. The door slid open to reveal a large chamber filled with crates and equipment. Unlike life support, Storage Bay C appeared untouched by the entity. The explosives they needed were kept in a reinforced cabinet at the far end of the room. "Keep watch," Mei told Darius as she hurried to the cabinet. Using her access code again, she opened it to reveal several compact devices, shaped demolition charges designed for precision mining work. Each one packed enough power to collapse a small cavern. "How many do we need?" she called over her shoulder. "Depends on what we are trying to do," Darius replied, keeping his eyes on the door. "Disrupt the entity long enough to escape? Maybe 3 or 4, strategically placed. But if we want to make sure this thing never threatens anyone else." He didn't finish the thought, but Mei understood. If they wanted to be certain to destroy the entity completely, they would need to use all the charges they had. And that would mean destroying the entire outpost, possibly creating enough of a seismic event to destabilize a significant portion of Europita's crust, a suicide mission. Before she could respond, the lights in the storage bay flickered. A moment later, the door they'd entered through began to close on its own. "It's found us," Darius shouted, lunging to block the door with a piece of equipment. "It's in the systems." Mei quickly gathered all the explosive charges she could carry, securing them in a pack. "Is there another way out?" she asked, scanning the room. "Maintenance shaft," Darius said, pointing to a hatch in the floor. "Runs under the main corridor all the way back to the central hub." The door was closing inexorably despite Darius's efforts to block it. Beyond, in the corridor, Mei could see the silvery substance flowing toward them, moving faster than before. "Go!" Darius shouted. "I will hold it as long as I can. Not without you." Mei grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the maintenance hatch. Together, they wrenched it open and dropped down into the cramped tunnel below, pulling the hatch shut behind them just as the entity reached the door to eye in the dim emergency lighting of the maintenance shaft. Mei and Darius paused to catch their breath. Above them, they could hear the entity moving around the storage bay, a sound like liquid metal flowing over metal surfaces. "It's learning," Mei said quietly. "Getting faster. Smarter." Darius nodded grimly. "Which means we are running out of time." They began crawling through the maintenance shaft, moving as quietly as possible. The original plan, to plant explosives at strategic points throughout the outpost, creating a series of electromagnetic pulses that would temporarily disable the entity while they escaped in the shuttle, now seemed increasingly impractical. "We need a new plan," Mei said as they reached a junction in the maintenance tunnels. "At the rate that thing is evolving, even if we make it back to the others, I'm not sure we will have time to plant all these charges before it overwhelms us." Darius was quiet for a moment, thinking. "What about the drilling platform?" he finally said. "The one we were using when we first breached the entity's chamber. What about it?" It goes straight down to where the entity came from. If we could send all these explosives down the shaft and detonate them at the source, we might be able to collapse the entire chamber. May finished, understanding dawning. Bury whatever's down there under millions of tons of rock. It was a desperate plan, but it might work. The drilling platform was at the edge of the outpost, accessible via the exterior rather than through the habitat modules where the entity was concentrated. We need EVA suits, Darius pointed out. There's an emergency locker near the airlock to the surface facilities, May said. If we can reach it. A strange vibration ran through the maintenance shaft, causing dust to drift down from above. The singing they'd heard in life support was audible again, but distorted, as if coming from multiple sources throughout the outpost. It's spreading through the entire structure, Darius said, a note of awe in his voice despite their dire situation. Integrating with everything. Then we'd better move fast, May replied, already crawling toward the central hub where they could access the surface airlock. Yes, they moved through the maintenance tunnels. The vibrations grew stronger, and with them came a sense of presence, as if the very walls around them were becoming aware of their existence. More than once, May saw small droplets of a silvery substance seeping through joints in the tunnel walls, probing, searching. Finally, they reached the access point to the central hub. May carefully pushed open the hatch and peered out. The hub, once the bustling heart of the outpost, was transformed almost beyond recognition. The entity had reshaped it into a grotesque parody of human architecture, with flowing, organic-looking structures that served purposes she couldn't begin to comprehend. But the path to the surface airlock was clear, at least for the moment. And the emergency locker with the EVA suits was still visible, apparently untouched. On my mark, she whispered to Darius. We go straight for the locker, get the suits, and head for the airlock. Don't stop for anything. Darius nodded, his face set with determination. 3, 2, 1, mark. They burst from the maintenance hatch and sprinted across the hub. Almost immediately, the entity reacted. Tendrils of silvery matter flowed from the walls, ceiling, and floor, converging on their position with frightening speed. May reached the emergency locker first, yanking it open to reveal 2 EVA suits inside. She grabbed one and tossed the other to Darius, who caught it one-handed while using his infrared cutter to hold back an approaching tendril. Put on, she shouted, already stepping in her own suit. The standard procedure for donning an EVA suit took at least 5 minutes with assistance. They had maybe 30 seconds. Somehow, running on pure adrenaline and desperation, they managed it. The suits weren't properly sealed in all places, and May knew the oxygen supply would be compromised, but it would have to do. The important thing was the radiation and thermal protection the suits would provide on the surface. Airlock, she yelled, and they made a final sprint across the hub as the entity's tendrils closed in from all sides. They reached the airlock just as the silvery matter surged forward in a wave, slamming the inner door shut behind them as it crashed against the reinforced barrier. The airlock cycle seemed to take an eternity. Through the small view pane in the inner door, May could see the entity probing the seals, looking for a way in. The singing had risen to a fever pitch, vibrating through the very structure of the outpost. Finally, the outer door opened, revealing the stark, airless landscape of Europita's surface. They stepped out, and the door closed behind them, cutting off the entity, at least temporarily. How much oxygen do we have? May asked over the suit comm as they started making their way toward the drilling platform, visible about 200 meters away across the rocky terrain. Darius checked his readings. 28 minutes at normal consumption. Less if we are exerting ourselves, which we definitely are. It will have to be enough, May said grimly. They moved as quickly as they could in the low gravity, bounding across the surface in long, arcing jumps. Behind them, the habitat dome rose like a geometric bubble against the stark landscape, parts of it now discolored where the entity had begun to reshape the exterior as well. The drilling platform loomed ahead, its massive structure still intact. The drilling operation had been fully automated, controlled from within the habitat, which meant the platform itself had been spared the entity's touch. So as they approached. However, Mei saw something that made her heart sink. At the base of the platform, where the drill shaft descended into Europita's crust, a silvery puddle was forming, more of the entity emerging from the depths. It's coming up from below as well, she said, pointing. Darius swore under his breath. We need to move faster. They reached the platform and clambered up the access ladder to the control station. Through the reinforced viewport, Mei could see the drill shaft, a yawning hole nearly 3 meters in diameter that plunged straight down into darkness. Around its edges, the silvery substance was spreading, flowing upward against gravity like something out of a nightmare. The charges, she said, opening her pack. We need to set them up quickly. Working together, they prepared the explosive devices, linking them with detonator cords and setting the trigger mechanism to Fatima's frequency. If the communications specialist had succeeded in building the remote detonator, they would be able to trigger the explosives from a safe distance, assuming they could get to a safe distance in time. Oxygen at 18 minutes, Darius reported tensely as they finished rigging the last charge. Mei nodded, making a final check of the setup. They had positioned the explosives around the drill shaft, angled to direct the blast downward. When detonated, they would collapse the shaft and hopefully bury whatever lay at its bottom under tons of moon rock. We are ready, she said. Let's get back to the shuttle. As they turned to leave, however, a new sound came over their suit comms, a burst of static followed by Dr. Ivanov's voice, tight with fear. Mei, Darius, do you copy? The entity has breached the emergency shelter. We have been forced to evacuate to the shuttle, but it's right behind us. We need that distraction now. Mei exchanged a look with Darius. Elena, we are at the drilling platform. Charges are set, but we need time to get clear. We don't have time, came the grim reply. It's at the shuttle bay doors. If we don't launch in the next 2 minutes, we are not launching at all. What about Fatima's remote detonator? Darius asked urgently. We have it, but the entity is interfering with the signal. We can't get a clear transmission to the charges. Mei closed her eyes briefly, understanding what this meant. Someone would need to stay behind to trigger the explosives manually. Someone would need to sacrifice themselves to ensure the others escaped. Get the shuttle ready for launch, she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. We will trigger the charges from here to buy you the time you need. Mei, no. Dr. Abernathy's voice cut in. There has to be another way. There isn't, she replied simply. The remote won't work, and we can't risk that thing following you or gaining access to the dream. This ends here. A moment of silence on the comm, then Dr. Ivanov's voice again, subdued. We understand. Thank you, Mei. Thank you, Darius. Actually, Darius said, turning to Mei, only one of us needs to stay. Before she could react, he unclipped the manual detonator from his belt and stepped back. Go, Mei. Get to the shuttle. I will trigger the charges. No, she said firmly. I'm a chief engineer. This is my responsibility, which is exactly why you need to survive, Darius countered. The TSF will need your knowledge of this entity when they arrive. You're the one who can make sure they understand what they are dealing with. Mei wanted to argue, but a glance at her oxygen gauge silenced her. 14 minutes left, barely enough time to reach the shuttle if she left immediately. Darius, I can't just leave you here, she said, her voice breaking as he managed a smile, visible through his helmet visor. Sure you can. Besides, I will have one hell of a view when this thing blows. He nodded toward the horizon, where the gas giant HD 209458B hung in the sky, its swirling storms visible even from this distance. Not a bad place to end the journey. Over the comm, Jacob's voice cut in urgently. Entities breaching the shuttle bay. We are beginning launch sequence now. Go, Darius said, giving Mei a gentle push toward the ladder. They need you, Mei. With tears blurring her vision, May clasped Darius's hand once, then turned and began descending the platform. Behind her, she heard him say quietly over the comm, "It's been an honor, Chief." She moved across Europita's surface as quickly as her EVA suit would allow, bounding in long arcs toward the shuttle bay on the far side of the habitat. Through gaps in the structure, she could see the shuttle's engines beginning their pre-ignition sequence, a pale blue glow emanating from the thrusters. "I'm on my way," she called over the comm. "Hold the launch as long as you can. Hurry." Jacob's voice was tight with strain. "The entity is through the outer doors." May pushed herself harder, ignoring the warnings on her suit display about increased oxygen consumption. If she didn't reach the shuttle in time, oxygen wouldn't matter anyway. She rounded the final curve of the habitat and saw the shuttle bay ahead, and with it a horrifying sight. The entity had indeed breached the outer doors and was flowing into the bay like a silver tide, already reaching toward the shuttle's landing struts. "Launch now," she shouted into her comm. "Don't wait for me. Not without you." Dr. Abernathy's voice came back. Make heed her private channel to Darius. "Now, Darius, detonate now." For a moment, there was no response. Then Darius's voice, calm despite everything. "Understood, Chief. Good luck." A second later, the ground beneath May's feet shuddered violently. A massive plume of dust and debris erupted from the direction of the drilling platform as the explosives detonated, sending a shock wave racing across Europita's surface. The effect on the entity was immediate and dramatic. The silvery mass in the shuttle bay convulsed, its flowing movement suddenly erratic. Tendrils that had been reaching for the shuttle withdrew, recoiling as if in pain. May didn't waste the opportunity. With a final, desperate burst of speed, she leaped across the remaining distance to the shuttle bay, sailing through the compromised doors and into the bay itself. The shuttle's boarding ramp was still extended, and Jacob stood in the doorway, reaching out to her. "Come on," he shouted.